Please, please help me. My husband is dying. She grabbed the sleeve of the most feared man in Detroit, a mountain of leather and iron who had made grown men cross the street just to avoid his shadow. Her frail hand trembled against his tattooed arm. The whole block went silent. Nobody touched Bear. Nobody. And yet this tiny gray-haired woman in a faded house dress was gripping him like he was the last rope over a cliff. And Bear looked down at her. If this story moves you, hit subscribe right now. Drop your city in the comments so I can see exactly how far this story has traveled. Stay with me until the very end. You will not regret it. The evening Martha Lawson stepped off that cracked sidewalk curb and walked toward Bear was the evening that everyone on Maplewood Avenue decided they had gone completely insane because no one, not even Detroit's most battle-hardened residents, would ever willingly walk toward that man. Bear had pulled his Harley to the curb the way he always did, like the street belonged to him, like the rumble of his engine was a warning shot fired into the chest of the neighborhood. 6'3", 250 pounds of pure weathered force. His leather vest carried patches that other men had bled for, and at least 2 of those patches had made city prosecutors lose sleep. His beard was thick and iron gray, his knuckles were scarred, and his eyes dark flat, calculating, were the kind of eyes that processed a room the way a predator processes open ground. He had parked because he always parked on Maplewood on Thursday evenings. It was a ritual, nothing more. He would sit on his bike for a few minutes, smoke half a cigarette, and let the neighborhood know he was still there, still watching, still untouchable. It was a language the street understood, and the street always answered back with silence and averted eyes. That was the arrangement. That was how things worked. Until Martha. She came out of the apartment building at 4714 Maplewood like she had been launched from a cannon door slamming behind her, both hands pressed to her chest, eyes wild with something that went beyond fear. She was 72 years old, maybe 110 pounds soaking wet, wearing a blue house dress and one brown slipper and one bare foot because she had not had time, had not even thought about her feet because upstairs in apartment 3, C, her husband of 49 years, was on the floor, and she could not get him up, and she could not get through on the phone, and the ambulance dispatch had told her that all units were currently unavailable due to the ongoing labor action, and the estimated wait time was unclear. Arthur Lawson was 68 minutes into what would later be confirmed as a massive cardiac event, and the city of Detroit had told his wife that the estimated wait time was unclear. So Martha came outside. She stood on the sidewalk and looked up and down the street with the pure, stripped-back desperation of a woman who had run out of options and knew it. There were a few people on the block, a young man with earbuds in walking fast, a woman pushing a stroller who had already clocked Bear and was crossing to the other side, an older gentleman sitting on his own stoop who caught Martha's eye for exactly 1 second before he looked away. Nobody wanted to get involved. Nobody wanted to be the person who stepped into whatever complicated, dangerous situation was unfolding outside 4714 Maplewood. That was Detroit street wisdom. You kept your head down, you kept moving, and then Martha saw Bear. She would tell people later that she didn't think. That was what she always said every single time someone asked her about that moment. I didn't think, I just saw a man. She said she didn't see the patches or the bike or the size of him. She said she saw a man standing on solid ground who looked like he was capable of doing something, and Arthur was upstairs running out of time, and so she walked toward him. Everyone else on the block stopped moving. The young man with the earbuds actually pulled them out. The old man on the stoop leaned forward. Because Martha Lawson, tiny trembling, one shoe on and one shoe off, walked directly up to the most feared Hell's Angel in the Detroit. Chapter grabbed the sleeve of his leather vest with both hands and said, "Please, please help me. My husband is dying." Bear did not move. Not a single muscle in his face changed. He looked down at her hands on his sleeve, those small, shaking hands with their thin skin and their swollen knuckles, and their wedding ring that had not left her finger in 49 years, and he looked at them for a long moment. The street held its breath. "Lady," his voice was low, gravel and bass, the kind of voice that came from the bottom of something deep. "You need to let go of my jacket." Martha did not let go. "My husband," she said again, and her voice broke completely on the second word, cracked right down the middle, like something that had been holding under pressure for a very long time. "He's on the floor, 3rd floor. He can't get up. I called the ambulance and they said they don't know when, please. Please, I don't have anyone else. Bear stared at her. Not through her, at her. That was the thing people on the block noticed. He was actually looking at her. Really looking the way you look at something that has caught you completely off guard. The ambulances aren't running, Martha said. And she said it the way you say the most absurd, most impossible thing out loud for the first time, like saying it might make it make sense. They're on strike. The man on the phone told me the wait time was unclear. He's been on the floor for I don't know how long. I don't know. Please, I don't have anyone else. I don't know what else to do. Stop. Bear held up one hand. His jaw was working. What floor? Third. Apartment 3C. The elevator's been broken for 6 months. The super doesn't. Is he conscious? Martha's breath caught. He was. He was talking to me. He said my name, but when I came back, he wasn't answering me the same way, and his color. She stopped, pressed her fist against her mouth, breathed. His color is wrong. Bear looked at her for 2 more seconds. Then he swung off the bike. He moved fast for a man his size, not running, not scrambling, but moving with the kind of deliberate, immediate purpose that made people step back without knowing why. He pulled out his phone as he walked toward the building door, and the call connected before he even reached the handle. Dagger. Short. Flat. I'm at 4714 Maplewood. I've got a man down 3rd floor, possible cardiac. Ambulances aren't running. Yeah, the strike. I need the chapter's medical transport and I need it in the next 8 minutes. Get Riggs and get Torres and whoever else is close. Now. He ended the call and pushed through the door. Martha scrambled after him, half running to keep up with his stride, her one bare foot slapping the linoleum of the hallway floor. The stairs are at the end, the door with the broken handle. I see it. He was already at the stairwell. Martha followed him up, and it took her longer because her knees were what they were, and she could hear him above her, his boots on the stairs, steady and fast. By the time she reached the 3rd floor landing, she was breathing hard, her hand on the iron rail, and she looked down the hallway, and the door to 3C was already open. She had left it open when she ran out. She came through the door, and Bear was already on his knees on the kitchen floor beside Arthur. Arthur Lawson was a lean man, a quiet man, the kind of man who had worked 31 years at the Ford assembly plant and spent his weekends tending a small container garden on the apartment balcony and watching baseball with the volume just loud enough to hear from the kitchen. He had a full head of white hair and hands that were still strong from decades of physical work. And right now, those hands were at his sides, and his face was a terrible color, ashen and damp, and his breathing was shallow and wrong. Bear had 2 fingers at Arthur's throat. He was counting. He's got a pulse, he said, and he said it directly to Martha as she came through the door, not to soften it, not to perform reassurance, just giving her the data. It's irregular, but it's there. When did this start? I'm not sure I heard him fall. He called my name. That was... Martha looked at the clock on the microwave, the numbers blurred. Maybe an hour ago, maybe a little more. Bear's jaw tightened slightly. 1 hour was a long time for what this looked like. He didn't say that. Sir, he leaned over Arthur and raised his voice slightly, not shouting but clear and direct. Sir, my name is Bear. Can you hear me? Squeeze my hand if you can hear me. Silence. 2 seconds. 3. Then Arthur's right hand moved. Not much. Just the faintest tightening of the fingers. Good. Bear's voice went lower, almost quieter than before. Good man, I got you. Stay with me. Martha made a sound she couldn't control, something between a sob and a gasp, and pressed her hand over her mouth again. Bear looked up at her. Does he have any heart medication? Anything I should know. Aspirin, she said immediately. He takes aspirin. He's supposed to. Doctor said, get it. She moved to the cabinet above the sink with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had managed this apartment and this man's health 4 decades, her hands steadier now that there was something to do. Something concrete, some action that was not just standing and waiting and being helpless. She had the aspirin in her hand in 4 seconds. Bear took it from her. Small sip of water, just a sip. He can't sit up. I'll get him up enough. And he did one large hand behind Arthur's shoulders, tilting him just barely, just enough. The aspirin went down. Arthur coughed once weakly and Bear held him through it. Easy, Bear said. quietly. Easy, brother. You're doing fine. Martha watched this enormous, tattooed, feared man hold her husband as carefully as she had ever held anything, and she felt something happen inside her chest that she would spend the rest of her life trying to find adequate words for. Then Bear's phone rang. "Talk to me," he answered. The voice on the other end was loud enough that Martha could hear fragments. 4 minutes out, 6 bikes. Daggers calling ahead to Detroit. General, they know we're coming. 4 minutes. Bear looked at Martha. They're 4 minutes out. They're going to get him to the hospital. It's going to be okay. How do you know? Martha asked. Not accusatory, just honest. Just the question of a woman who needed to understand what she was holding on to. Bear looked at her steadily. Because I'm not letting it be anything else. Outside, the street was already reacting to what was coming. The people on Maplewood Avenue who had watched Martha grab Bear's sleeve, who had watched him go inside, who had been standing in various states of frozen uncertainty for the last 7 or 8 minutes, those people were now hearing something, a sound that grew, low at first, distant, like weather moving in from the west, then louder still. The young man with the earbuds looked up. The old man on the stoop stood up. And then 6 Hells Angels motorcycles came around the corner onto Maplewood Avenue, in formation, moving fast, filling the whole width of the narrow street. Their engines in enormous coordinated thunder that rattled the windows and said, in a language that needed no translation, move. Traffic stopped. People on the sidewalk stopped. A taxi driver rolled down his window to look and then immediately rolled it back up. The 6 bikes pulled up in front of 4714 and did not park so much as take position, 3 on one side, 3 on the other, engines still running, creating a corridor from the building entrance to the street. These were not men who smiled. These were not men who waved. They sat on their machines and they watched the surrounding street with the focused, sweeping attention of people who were very good at controlling what happened in the space around them. And they waited for Bear. Upstairs, Bear had heard them arrive. He looked at Arthur, whose color had not changed, but whose breathing had stabilized marginally, the aspirin working at the margins, buying minutes. They're here, Bear said. Arthur's eyes were open now, just barely. He found Bear's face and held it the way a man holds onto the nearest solid thing when the ground underneath him is uncertain. You got a hell of a wife, Bear said. Something shifted in Arthur's expression, faint but real. She came out and grabbed me. Bear shook his head slightly. Grabbed me right off my bike. I didn't know what hit me. Arthur's mouth moved. It took a moment, but the words came out thin and barely there. She's always been like that. Bear looked at him. Then he made a sound that if you had told anyone on Maplewood Avenue that Bear would make this sound, they would have told you that was completely impossible. It was something between a laugh and something much more complicated. Yeah, Bear said. Yeah, I bet she has. He got Arthur up. It took careful work, arm under the shoulders, one hand bracing, and he moved the man with a precision and a gentleness that had nothing to do with how he moved through the rest of his life. Arthur was not heavy, but he was dead weight in all the ways that mattered. And the stairwell was narrow, and there were 3 flights, and every single step required Bear to take the full measure of Arthur's weight and carry it forward. Martha went ahead of them, going down slowly, looking back every few steps. At the 2nd floor landing, Arthur made a sound, a short, sharp intake of breath, like something had clenched. Bear stopped immediately. Arthur? Firm. Talk to me. Arthur's hand gripped Bear's arm. I'm here. Pain. Chest. He breathed through it, slow and deliberate. It's passing. Bear held still and let him breathe. 30 seconds. The hallway was quiet. Okay, Arthur said. Okay, Bear repeated. They kept going. When they came out through the front door of the building, the scene on the street had changed. The 6 bikes were there, engines running, the corridor held. But there were also at least 30 people watching now. Residents who had come out of buildings, people who had stopped walking, a couple of people recording on their phones, who immediately lowered them when the nearest Hells Angel looked in their direction. A man detached from the bike's dagger medium, height lean with a gray-streaked beard, and the kind of eyes that had seen things. He came forward and took Arthur's other side without being asked, without a word, and he and Bear moved Arthur to the waiting transport together. Martha was right there at every step. As they loaded Arthur, she leaned close to his ear and said his name. She said it the way you only say someone's name after 49 years, when the name itself carries everything you have never been able to put into other words. Arthur's eyes found her. "I'm here," he said, barely a whisper. "I know," Martha said. "I know you are. They're going to take care of you. I'll be right there." Bear was on his phone again. He was talking to Detroit General, giving them what he had approximate time of onset pulse rate, aspirin-administered current presentation. He used medical language that made the man on the other end of the phone pause slightly, like he was recalibrating who he was speaking to. When he hung up, he caught Martha watching him. "Army," he said, simply, answering the question she hadn't asked. "Long time ago." Martha looked at him. This man who had frightened every person on this block for however many years he had claimed this corner. This man who had just carried her husband down 3 flights of stairs with the careful hands of someone who understood on a fundamental level what it meant for a life to be fragile. "Thank you," she said. And she said it the only way it could be said, the way that meant everything, and acknowledged that thank you was not even close to adequate, but it was all language had to offer. Bear looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once. "Get in the transport," he said. "Stay with your husband." She got in. The door closed. The engines on Maplewood Avenue raced together, 6 bikes in 1 transport, and Bear's Harley at the front, and the convoy moved out into the Detroit evening like a force of nature that had decided for reasons that defied everything the street thought it understood about how the world worked to do something gentle. The crowd on the sidewalk stood and watched them go. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then the old man on the stoop sat back down slowly and looked at the empty street where they had been. "Well," he said to no one in particular, "I'll be damned." And the street had no argument to offer. The transport was not built for speed. It was a modified van, one of the chapters used for hauling equipment on long runs, and it had been converted in the back with a flat surface and basic supplies that Riggs, who had done 2 tours in Fallujah as a combat medic before he ever touched a motorcycle, had insisted on keeping stocked. It was not an ambulance. It did not have a defibrillator or an IV line or a cardiac monitor. What it had was Riggs and Riggs' hands and Riggs's 22 years of knowing what a man looked like when his heart was betraying him. Riggs climbed in the back beside Arthur the moment the door closed, and Martha felt the van begin to move. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was surprisingly gentle for a man with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw. "I need you to hold his hand and talk to him. Can you do that?" "Yes," Martha said immediately. She was already holding Arthur's hand. "Tell him normal things. Your voice is going to do more right now than anything I can do. You understand?" Martha nodded. She turned to Arthur and she started talking. She talked about the container garden on the balcony, how the tomatoes were coming in slow this year, how she thought it was the sun angle, how she had moved the pot twice and still wasn't satisfied. She talked about it the way you talk about something small and ordinary when you are trying to build a bridge across a very terrifying distance. She kept her voice steady. It cost her everything she had to keep it steady. Arthur's eyes stayed on her face. Outside Bear Road at the front of the convoy, and the Detroit streets did something they almost never did for anything short of a presidential motorcade they opened. Cars pulled over, and intersections cleared. Whether it was the sound of the bikes or the sight of 6 Hells Angels riding formation with a van, something about the convoy communicated urgency in a frequency that cut through the ordinary noise of evening traffic and made people instinctively get out of the way. Dagger rode tight on the left flank and had his phone to his ear for the entire ride, talking to Detroit General's emergency intake, updating them every 90 seconds. He did not particularly enjoy talking to hospitals. He had spent a significant portion of his adult life trying to avoid them, but he was talking now, and he was precise, and the charge nurse on the other end of the line had stopped twice to ask him to repeat his credentials before understanding that there were no credentials, that this was simply a man on a motorcycle who was trying to keep another man alive, and that sometimes that was what the world handed you. Inside the van, Riggs was monitoring Arthur's pulse with 2 fingers at the wrist, counting quietly in his head, watching the color of the man's face, watching his breathing. He had seen this before. He had seen it in the field, and he had seen it in bars, and he had seen it in the parking lots of truck stops at 2 in the morning, because death did not schedule itself around convenient locations. He knew what the trajectory looked like, and he knew that the margin they were working in was real but thin. "Arthur," Riggs leaned forward. "Stay awake for me, you hear me? Don't go to sleep." "I'm not sleeping," Arthur said, and his voice was thin, but there was something in it, a particular dry stubbornness that made Martha make a sound that was almost a laugh. "That's him," she said. "That's exactly him." "Good," Riggs said. "Then tell him I need him to keep being exactly him for about 6 more minutes." Arthur's fingers tightened on Martha's hand. 6 minutes, he repeated, like it was a contract. 6 minutes, she said back. On the street outside, they were passing through an intersection when a silver sedan failed to register the convoy fast enough and started to pull forward. The Hells Angel on the right flank, a man the chapter called Torres, who was built like a fire hydrant and had a voice that carried over engine noise, without effort turned his head and made eye contact with the sedan's driver and said absolutely nothing. He didn't need to. The sedan reversed immediately back into its lane, back out of the way, and Torres returned his eyes to the road ahead. Nobody in the chapter laughed about it. Nobody even acknowledged it. They were working. That was the thing about Bear's chapter that most people never understood, the thing that lived underneath the reputation and the patches and the mythology of fear. These men knew how to work. They knew how to operate under pressure and motion with high stakes and limited margin. They had built that capacity over years of being the kind of people who operated outside the boundaries of conventional order. And right now, on this Thursday evening in Detroit, that capacity was pointed entirely in the direction of getting one white-haired man with a failing heart to an emergency room before the math ran out on them. Bear had not said a word since the convoy left Maplewood Avenue. He rode and he calculated distance, timed the traffic patterns of each block, what he could push and what he couldn't. He had done this kind of riding before. Escort work, protective formation, high-speed convoy, in situations where the cost of error was not a bent fender. His body remembered the discipline of it, even when his mind was occupied with something else entirely. And his mind was occupied with something else entirely. He kept coming back to Martha's hands on his sleeve. The specific quality of that grip, not aggressive, not demanding, just completely honest. The hands of a woman who had no cards left to play and knew it and reached for him anyway. He could not remember the last time someone had reached for him like that, without calculation, without an angle. Just please, you're the only one here, and I'm out of options, and I'm choosing to believe you can help me. He did not know what to do with that, so he rode. Detroit General came into view, and Dagger was already on the phone again, and when the convoy pulled into the emergency bay, there were 2 nurses and a doctor already outside, already moving toward the van before it fully stopped, because Dagger had spent the last 6 minutes making sure they would be. The back doors opened. Riggs gave his report in under 45 seconds: onset time, aspirin administration, pulse rate, and quality respiratory status level of consciousness throughout transport. The doctor listened without interrupting, nodding, already making decisions. They had Arthur on a gurney and through the emergency doors in under 90 seconds. Martha followed them to the doors, and then the doors closed in front of her, and she was standing in the emergency bay alone for the first time since she had walked out of her apartment building and grabbed a stranger by the sleeve. The adrenaline that had been holding her upright chose that moment to begin its retreat. Her knees went uncertain. She put one hand on the wall beside the emergency doors and breathed. Behind her, she heard boots on pavement. "Mrs. Lawson," it was Bear's voice. She turned around. He was standing a few feet away, helmet off, looking at her with that same direct attention he had turned on her on Maplewood Avenue. The other 5 riders were behind him, some of them on their bikes, some standing, all of them present in the specific way that large men in leather vests are present, taking up space but not threateningly. Just there. "He made it here," Bear said. "That was the hard part." "Is it?" Martha's voice came out more fragile than she intended. "Is that the hard part?" Bear held her gaze. "The hard part you had control over. What happens in there?" He tilted his head toward the emergency doors. "Those people know what they're doing. You let them do it." Martha looked at him. This man she had grabbed on a sidewalk an hour ago. This man whose name she had not even known, whose world she had no map for, who had every reason in the world to have simply ridden away, and not one conventional reason to have done anything else. And she said, "Why did you help me?" The question sat in the air between them. Bear was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable with the question, just letting it land where it needed to land before he answered it. "You grabbed my sleeve," he said finally. "That's not an answer?" "No," he agreed, "it's not." He looked past her at the emergency doors for a second, then back. "I had a mother," he said. "She's gone now, but She was about your size. He stopped. That was apparently as far as he was going with that particular direction. He adjusted course. And you weren't afraid of me? That's rarer than you'd think. I was terrified of you, Martha said. Something shifted in his face. Then you've got more guts than half the people I know. A nurse appeared at the emergency bay door. Mrs. Lawson, her voice was careful, professional. Can you come with me? We have some paperwork and the doctor wants to speak with you as soon as... I'm coming, Martha said. She turned back to Bear. She looked at all of them, all 6 of these men who had ridden into her evening and turned it into something she did not have language for yet. Thank you, she said. All of you. I don't have anything to give you. I don't know how to... Go be with your husband, Dagger said. His voice was rougher than Bear's, less controlled, but he meant it the same way. Martha nodded. She looked at Bear one more time. Then she went through the doors. The chapter stood in the emergency bay and listened to the doors close. Then Riggs said, his pulse was steadying at the end. That's a good sign. Nobody responded immediately. They just stood there in the way men stand when they have done something and are not entirely sure what to do with it afterward. There was no protocol for this. There was no patch for it. It was just something that had happened, something they had done, and now the evening was continuing around them, and the hospital was doing its work, and they were standing in a parking bay, feeling, several of them, though none would have chosen to describe it this way, feeling something. Bear put his helmet back on. All right, he said. They rode back. Inside Detroit General, the next 4 hours were the longest of Martha Lawson's life. She sat in a waiting room chair with her hands folded in her lap and her one bare foot on the cold floor, and she did not let herself think in any direction that went further than the next 5 minutes. She had learned that from Arthur, actually his particular discipline around worry, his insistence that you could only deal with what was directly in front of you. She had always found it frustrating when he said it. Right now, it was the only thing keeping her functional. A young woman from admissions came and helped her with the paperwork and did not comment on the bare foot, for which Martha was quietly grateful. A security guard brought her a pair of foam hospital socks without being asked, just set them on the chair beside her and walked away, and she put them on and felt absurdly like crying again. At the 2-hour mark, a doctor came out. Martha stood up before he reached her because she had been watching the door with the specific vigilance of someone who was not going to be caught off guard by what came through it. The doctor was young, younger than she expected. He had kind eyes and tired posture, and he held his clipboard slightly in front of him like a small shield. Mrs. Lawson. Yes. I'm Dr. Okafor. Your husband is stable. He said it before anything else, which Martha recognized immediately as a mercy. He's had a significant cardiac event, a myocardial infarction, what we commonly call a heart attack. We've got him on medication, he's responding well, and we're going to be taking him for a procedure shortly to address the blockage. But he's stable, and I want you to know that. Martha sat back down because her legs made the decision for her. The timing matters a great deal in these situations. Dr. Okafor continued, sitting across from her. Every minute of delay means more damage to the cardiac muscle. The fact that he received aspirin early and that he was transported here as quickly as he was... He paused. How did you get him here so fast? The dispatch notes say no ambulance units were dispatched. Martha looked at him. Someone help me, she said. Dr. Okafor waited, clearly expecting more. Someone, I asked, Martha said. Someone who said yes. The doctor looked at her for a moment, seeming to understand that this was all she was going to offer on the subject. He moved on professionally, but something in his expression had shifted slightly, a kind of quiet acknowledgement that whatever had happened to get this man here this fast had been remarkable, and that he was the beneficiary of it. Can I see him? Martha asked. In a little while. Once we've completed the procedure, someone will come get you. He stood. He's a fighter, Mrs. Lawson. That helps more than the people realize. After he left, Martha sat very still and looked at her foam socks on the waiting room floor. She thought about Bear's face when he knelt down to Arthur on the kitchen floor. The way his whole body had changed, this enormous, feared, leather-clad force of the streets, simply dropping to his knees on a kitchen linoleum and pressing 2 fingers to the throat of a man he had never met, and counting quietly, methodically, with absolute focus. She thought about what he had said. I had a mother. She's gone now. She was about your size. She thought about all the things that made a person into what the world decided they were, the choices and the histories and the losses and the hardening that happened over decades of being exactly who you were in a world that was not always kind about it. She thought about how completely wrong she had been, about what she would find when she walked up to that motorcycle. She had been looking for a man who could help her. She had found one. Back on Maplewood Avenue, the street had not settled. The people who had watched it all happen were still out on stoops and doorways talking in small clusters, in the way people talk when they have witnessed something that disrupted the story they thought they were living in. The old man who had averted his eyes when Martha first came out was now holding court with three of his neighbors, telling it in the way stories get told immediately after, still raw, still slightly unbelievable, even to the teller. She just walked right up to him, the old man was saying. Just walked right up. I thought, God forgive me, I thought this woman is about to get herself killed. And then he got off the bike. He called the others, said a woman from the second floor who had watched from her window. He got on the phone and called them like it was nothing, like this was just something you do. Maybe for them it is. Someone else offered. Nobody had a good answer to that. A teenage boy who had been recording on his phone and who had stopped recording when one of the Hells Angels looked at him, but had started again once they were gone, capturing the empty street in the space where the convoy had been, was sitting on a stoop looking at his footage. He was not sure what to do with it. He watched it back twice. Then he put his phone in his pocket and sat there thinking, because some things when they happen right in front of you require more processing time than a phone screen can offer. At Detroit General, the night moved forward in the way hospital nights do, slow and fast, at the same time measured in small updates and waiting room footsteps, and the particular institutional quiet that settles over a building full of high stakes and fluorescent lights. Martha was brought back to see Arthur at just past 10 o'clock, and when she came through the curtain and saw him propped up, slightly wires and monitors, pale but recognizably himself, his eyes opening when he heard her step, she sat down in the chair beside his bed and took his hand and did not say anything for a long moment. Martha. His voice was rough but present. I'm here. The men on the motorcycles. His brow furrowed slightly. That was real. That was real, as she said. Arthur processed this. Who were they? Martha considered the question. Who were they? The feared Hells Angels of the Detroit chapter. Men with patches and histories and reputations that had made an entire city block step back. Men who had ridden a convoy through Detroit traffic on a Thursday evening because a 72-year-old woman in one shoe had asked one of them for help. They were the people who were there, she said finally. Arthur looked at her for a moment. Then something happened to his expression, a slow, tired softening. The big one, Arthur said. The one who carried me. He held my hand on the stairs. I know. He told me I was going to make it. Arthur's thumb moved over her knuckles. He said, hold on, brother. Just like that. Martha felt the tears coming in again and did not stop them this time. Were you scared? She asked. Terrified, Arthur said, until he said that. A pause. Funny thing is, when he said it, I believed him. I don't know why. Big, scary man with tattoos on his hands, and I believed him. Because he meant it, Martha said. Arthur nodded. His eyes were getting heavy. The medication, the procedure, the long, terrible hour on the kitchen floor, it was all collecting its debt now. Martha, he said right at the edge of sleep. Yes. Tomorrow, I want to send them something. Flowers or, I don't know, something. Martha almost laughed. I don't know how to reach them. Figure it out, Arthur murmured. You figured out everything else tonight. He was asleep before she could answer. Martha sat in the chair beside his bed and listened to the monitors and the quiet hospital sounds and the distant traffic of the Detroit night. She was still wearing the foam socks. She was still in her faded blue house dress. She had not eaten anything since lunch, and she was exhausted in a way that went down to the cellular level. And she was in a way she could not yet fully articulate different than she had been this morning. Something had been rearranged in her understanding of how the world worked. Some foundational assumption she had not even known she was carrying had been quietly and thoroughly dismantled by a man named Bear and the 6 riders who had followed him without question because he had told them someone needed help. She did not know his last name. She did not know his real name. She did not know his history or his chapter or any of the things that the street used to define him. She knew that he had gotten off his motorcycle when she asked him to. She knew that he had gone up 3 flights of stairs without hesitation and knelt beside her husband and counted his pulse with two careful fingers. She knew that he had talked Arthur down 3 flights of stairs and into a transport with the steadiness of a man who had decided in the space of a 2-second look that this was simply what the next hour of his life was going to be, and there was nothing complicated about that. She thought about what he had said when she asked him why. "You grabbed my sleeve." She turned it over in her mind. The simplicity of it. Not a story about redemption or character or hidden depths, just a woman who grabbed his sleeve and a man who was grabbed. It can just contact. Just the oldest, most fundamental thing, one person reaching toward another across every difference the world had put between them and the other person reaching back. She fell asleep in the chair holding Arthur's hand, and outside Detroit settled into its Thursday night, and somewhere on the west side of the city, 6 motorcycles were quiet on their kickstands, and the men who rode them were in their homes or their clubhouse or wherever they went when the work was done, and none of them probably would have described what they did tonight as anything other than a thing that needed doing. But it was more than that. It was always more than that. Martha woke up with her cheek on the side of Arthur's hospital bed, and her hand still wrapped around his, and for one disoriented second, she did not know where she was. Then the monitors beeped, and the curtain rustled with the movement of a nurse passing outside, and it all came back, not gradually the way some memories return, but all at once, the entire previous evening landing on her chest like something physical. She sat up. Arthur was still sleeping. His color was better. Not good, not the color of a man who was fine, but measurably better than the terrible ashen quality it had held on the kitchen floor. And Martha studied his face the way you study something you have come very close to losing, with a new acute attention to detail, cataloging the particular way his eyebrows rested and the line of his jaw, and the way his chest rose and fell, slow and steady, under the thin hospital blanket. She stayed like that for several minutes, just watching him breathe, letting it be enough. A nurse came in at 7 to check Arthur's vitals and was clearly surprised to find Martha awake and upright in the chair, still in her house dress, foam socks on her feet, hair that had seen better days with the composed dignity of a woman who had simply decided that she was not going to fall apart today. "Mrs. Lawson," the nurse said carefully, "did you sleep at all?" "A little," Martha said. "Is Dr. Okafor in?" "He'll be on rounds by 8. The nurse checked the monitors, made notes, glanced at Martha again. "Can I get you some coffee, some breakfast?" "Coffee would be wonderful," Martha said. "Thank you." The nurse left and came back with a small cup and a packaged muffin that Martha ate without tasting, because her body needed fuel, and standing on ceremony about hospital muffins was not something she had the bandwidth for. She drank the coffee and watched Arthur sleep, and when Dr. Okafor came through the curtain at 8:05, she was on her feet before he reached the bedside. "Good progress," he said before she could ask. He had clearly learned from the previous night that Martha Lawson did not have patience for buildup. "The procedure went well. The blockage was significant. We're looking at a recovery period, lifestyle adjustments, follow-up cardiology. But the muscle damage is less extensive than it could have been." He paused. "Much less than it could have been given the timeline. But he's going to be all right," Martha said. Not a question. A statement that required confirmation. Dr. Okafor met her eyes. "Yes, with proper care and follow-through, yes." Martha breathed. A long, slow breath that seemed to travel from somewhere deep in her chest all the way out, carrying with it something she had been holding since the moment she heard Arthur call her name from the kitchen floor. "Thank you," she said. "Thank whoever got him here," Dr. Okafor said. He said it simply without decoration, the way a doctor says something true. Arthur woke up 40 minutes later to find Martha sitting exactly where she had been all night. He looked at her and she looked at him, and the look that passed between them was the particular look of two people who have been married long enough that entire conversations fit inside a single glance. This one said, I know, we're okay, we're still here." "Morning," Arthur said. "Good morning," Martha said. "My chest feels like someone sat on it." "Someone kinda did. Your heart tried to quit on you." Arthur considered this. "I'd like to have a word with it." Martha reached over and patted his hand. "Later. First you have to let the nurses do their checks and eat whatever they bring you and not argue about it." "I wasn't going to argue." "You were absolutely going to argue." Arthur's mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile yet. He didn't have the energy for a full smile, but it was the shape of one, and Martha felt something in her chest unclench completely. This, this right here, this was what she had walked it up to a stranger's motorcycle for. By 9 o'clock, the story was already moving. It started as these things do now on a phone. The teenager on Maplewood Avenue, 17 years old, name of Deshawn, who had recorded the aftermath of the convoy's departure, and then sat on the stoop thinking about whether to post it, had decided somewhere around midnight that what he had seen was the kind of thing that needed to be seen. His footage was not dramatic by social media standards. It was just an empty street and his own voice saying quietly to no one in particular, "That just happened. Hell's Angels they just saved that old man. I watched the whole thing. That just happened." He posted it. By morning, it had 40,000 views. By the time Martha was drinking her second cup of hospital coffee, it had 120,000 and was climbing fast. And the comment section was doing exactly what comment sections do. When something disrupts the story, people think they know. It was arguing. Half the comments were some version of disbelief. The other half were some version of, "I knew a biker once who was the kindest person I ever met. And boh, people are not what you think they are. And this made me cry on the bus." Several people had identified the chapter by the patches on the vest in the background of Deshawn's footage. Several others had recognized Maplewood Avenue. Someone who lived 2 blocks over had commented that they'd heard the convoy go past and had no idea what it was about. Someone else commented that the ambulance workers were still on strike and that the city should be ashamed. Bear did not have social media. Bear had never had social media and had no particular interest in acquiring it. What Bear had was a phone that rang at 9:47 in the morning with Dagger's number on the screen. "You're on the internet," Dagger said. Bear was quiet for a moment. He was sitting at a table in the back of the chapter's garage space, drinking coffee, not doing anything in particular. Define on the internet. Kid posted a video last night. Empty street talks about what happened. Got picked up. It's spreading. Does it have our faces in it? Backs of vests mostly. Chapter patches visible. Bear drank his coffee. Okay. There are reporters calling the chapter's general line. 2 of them so far. Tell them nothing. Already did. Dagger paused in the particular way that meant he was about to say something he had been deciding whether to say. They're saying things in the comments about us, about the chapter. Another pause. Good things. Bear was quiet again. The garage around him was familiar, the particular smell of oil and metal, the sound of the street outside, the ordinary morning sounds of a space that had been his in various ways for more than 2 decades. Good things, he repeated. Yeah. Well, Bear said, don't let it go to anyone's head. Dagger made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. Riggs wants to know if the old man made it. Bear set down his cup. This was the question that had been sitting at the back of his mind since he rode away from Detroit General the previous evening. He had not asked it aloud. He had gone back to the garage, and he had sat in his usual spot, and he had gone through the usual motions of an evening, and he had not asked the question because asking it meant acknowledging how much the answer mattered, and he had not quite been ready for that. I don't know, Bear said. He made it, Dagger said. Torres drove past the hospital this morning. Asked at the desk. Man's in stable condition. Bear put his hand flat on the table and looked at it for a moment. All right, he said. Thought you'd want to know. Tell Riggs. He hung up and sat there with his hand on the table and the morning moving around him, and he was thinking about Arthur Lawson saying, "You're going to make it back to him on those stairs," the way a man who is losing ground repeats a thing back to himself to make it real. He was thinking about the specific weight of Arthur in his arms on those stairs, not heavy, but the particular weight of a life that was close to its edge and needed something to hold it. He was thinking about Martha's hands on his sleeve. He was also thinking about the reporters. He did not want the reporters. He did not want the internet and the comments in the story about the Hell's Angel who saved the old couple, because that story was not the story he was interested in being inside of. He had not done what he did last night to become a story. He had done it because Martha grabbed his sleeve and he was not made of stone, and Arthur's pulse had been wrong in a way that his hands recognized immediately, and there had simply been no version of that moment where riding away was possible. That was all. That was the whole of it. But the world he was learning had other plans. At 11:15, Martha's granddaughter arrived at Detroit General in a state of barely controlled panic, having driven 4 hours from Columbus, the moment her mother Martha and Arthur's daughter Carol, who was herself in a hospital in Cincinnati with a broken hip from a fall 3 days earlier, which was the reason she hadn't been reachable the previous evening, had managed to get a message through. Her name was Simone. She was 31, sharp-eyed, competent, and currently operating on no sleep in the particular energized terror of someone who has been driving through the night towards something they did not fully understand. She came through the hospital doors like weather and found the nurse's station and found Martha's name in the system and was directed to Arthur's room and came through the curtain to find her grandmother sitting in a chair. Foam socks, blue house dress, second cup of terrible hospital coffee, looking for all the world like she had simply decided to spend a Thursday night in a hospital room and was perfectly fine with that. "Grandma!" Simone stopped in the doorway, took in the foam socks, took in Arthur asleep in the bed, took in the monitors, took in Martha's composure, which seen up close had the specific quality of something that had been maintained through significant effort over a significant number of hours. "Hi, sweetheart," Martha said. Simone crossed the room and took her grandmother's hands and looked at her face, and whatever she saw there made her breath catch. "Are you okay?" "I am," Martha said. "Your grandfather is going to be fine. Sit down." Simone sat. She looked at Arthur, who slept through her arrival with the impervious peace of a man on cardiac medication. Then she looked back at Martha. "Mom said the ambulances weren't running. She said you couldn't get through. How did he get here?" Martha looked at her granddaughter. This was the question, wasn't it? How did he get here? She had answered a version of it to Dr. Okafor in the most minimal way she could, and it had felt like the right amount to say, but Simone was not Dr. Okafor, and Simone was family, and Simone had driven 4 hours through the night. So Martha told her. She told it straight through, coming outside, seeing Bear grabbing his sleeve, the look on his face when he looked down at her hands. She told her about the phone call and the 6 bikes and the way they formed the corridor in the street. She told her about Bear going up 3 flights of stairs and kneeling on the linoleum without hesitating. She told her about Riggs in the back of the transport and Arthur counting 6 minutes like a contract and Bear riding point through Detroit traffic. She told it the way you tell something that you are still in the process of understanding yourself, with attention to detail, because the details were the thing, because every specific moment of it had mattered. Simone listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Simone, who was by nature and profession, she was a social worker in Columbus, someone who processed out loud. She listened with her hands around both of her grandmother's hands and her face doing complicated shifting things that she did not appear to be fully aware of. When Martha finished, Simone was quiet for a moment. "You walked up to a Hell's Angel," she said. "Yes." "You grabbed his vest." "I did." "Grandma," Simone's voice went somewhere complicated. "That man could have, but he didn't," Martha said, simply, completely. Simone looked at her, then she looked at Arthur in his hospital bed, then back at Martha. "No," she said quietly, "he didn't. He told me his mother was about my size," Martha said. "That's all he said about it. But I think that man has more inside him than the world gives him credit for." Simone was quiet again. Then she pulled out her phone and showed Martha the screen. Deshawn's video, the empty street, the comment numbers. "It's on the internet, Grandma. The whole thing, people are talking about it all over the place." Martha looked at the screen, looked at the numbers, looked at Deshawn's face in the corner of the frame, this teenager who had watched it all happen and felt compelled to say that just happened. "Good," Martha said. You don't want your privacy." "I'm 72 years old. Martha said. "My husband almost died last night because the city couldn't send an ambulance. And a man everyone on that street was afraid of carried him down 3 flights of stairs." She looked at Simone steadily. "If that's a story that needs telling, let it be told." Simone looked at her grandmother, really looked at her the way you look at someone when you realize they are larger than the category you've been keeping them in. The way grandchildren sometimes look at grandmothers and discover not the soft, familiar figure of family dinners and holiday visits, but an actual person with a spine of something very old and very solid. "Okay," Simone said softly. What neither of them knew yet was that the story had already outgrown Deshawn's video. A local Detroit news station had picked it up by mid-morning. By noon, a producer at a national morning program had flagged it. By 1 in the afternoon, 3 separate journalists were attempting to locate the Hells Angels chapter involved, and 2 of them had already reached out to the national organization's public contacts, and one of them had found Maplewood Avenue and was asking people on the street if they had seen anything. The old man from the stoop, whose name was Gerald, who had lived on Maplewood for 34 years, and had seen the block through versions of itself that the younger residents could not imagine, was talking to this journalist with the energized precision of a man who had been a reliable witness to something and knew it. "She walked right up to him," Gerald said for the third time to a third different person. "I want you to understand that. She walked right up the middle of the street, grabbed him, and you know what I thought? I thought, God forgive me, I thought that woman is going to get hurt. Because that's what you think. That's what the world has taught you to think when you see a man like that." He paused, and then he got off the bike. And I have been thinking about that ever since, the moment he got off the bike. The journalist wrote it down. Gerald watched the pen move and felt the particular quiet satisfaction of someone whose account of events is being recorded for the record. "What made you think he might help her?" the journalist asked. Gerald considered this. "I didn't think he would," he said honestly. "That's the thing. I didn't think he would. And that's what makes it the kind of thing you don't stop thinking about." On the west side of Detroit, Bear was not thinking about journalists or comment sections or Gerald on his stoop or the story that was spreading through the city's nervous system like something that needed to be passed on. He was thinking about the note. He had written it last night after he got back, sitting at the same table in the garage where he had taken Dagger's call this morning. He had written several versions of it, which was not something he was in the habit of admitting to anyone because Bear did not, as a general rule, spend significant time on written correspondence. But he had written several versions because each one felt wrong in a different way, too much or not enough, or trying too hard or not trying enough. He had settled eventually on the one that was the shortest because the shortest one was the most honest. He had put it with a rose, one red rose from the bodega 2 blocks from the garage, because the woman behind the counter had looked at him, reaching for a small bunch of something plastic wrapped, and said firmly, "No, wait," and gone in the back and come out with a single proper rose from her own private supply that she kept back there, and had said, "This one, take this one," and waved away the money he offered. He had not argued with her. He had gone back to Maplewood Avenue at close to midnight when the street was quiet, and he had put the rose in the note at the base of the steps of 4714 in the small concrete corner where the step met the railing where it would be sheltered from wind. And then he had ridden away, and that was supposed to be the end of his part in it. Except that Simone, coming out of Detroit General at 2 in the afternoon to get food and air and to call her mother in Cincinnati, had checked her phone and seen that the video had been shared by a Detroit community page that had 40,000 followers. And in the comments of that share, someone had posted a photo. It was a photo of the note and the rose taken by someone who had come across them on the steps of 4714 Maplewood that morning. The photo was close enough to read the note. "Kindness has no uniform. Take care of your husband. Bear." The photo had 4,000 likes. The comments beneath it were doing something that comment sections almost never do. They were being kind to each other. People were sharing things, stories about unexpected help from unexpected people. Moments where the person they least expected had been the person who showed up. The thread had none of the combativeness that normally characterized these spaces. It had the quality, instead of people who had been reminded of something they had forgotten and were sitting together in the remembering. Simone stood outside the hospital and read the note on her phone screen and felt something move through her that she recognized from her work. Those rare moments when something real and human and unrepeatable breaks through the surface of ordinary life and reminds you why any of it matters. She went back inside. She found Martha in Arthur's room, where Arthur was now awake and eating lunch with the resigned cooperation of a man who has been told he does not get to argue about his diet for the foreseeable future. "Grandma," Simone said, "he left you a note." Martha looked up from the chair where she had been encouraging Arthur through a container of low-sodium soup. "Who did?" Simone turned her phone and showed her the photo, the rose in the corner of the concrete step, and the note in handwriting that was large and deliberate and slightly uneven. The handwriting of a man who did not write often, but who was being careful with this particular set of words. "Kindness has no uniform. Take care of your husband. Bear. Martha looked at it for a long time. Arthur, who had been managing his soup with the focused attention of a man who was not going to give the soup the satisfaction of knowing he found it terrible, looked over at his wife's face and stopped. "Martha," he said, "what is it?" She looked up at him. Her eyes were bright in the way that meant she was refusing to cry, which Arthur recognized immediately, and which meant after 49 years that whatever was happening was significant. She turned Simone's phone and showed him the note. Arthur looked at the screen. "Read it once. Read it again." "Bear," he said, the name of a man he had met on a kitchen floor when he was not fully conscious, who had told him to hold on, brother, who had held his hand on the stairs, who had said, "You're going to make it," with the absolute certainty of someone who has decided to make it so. "Bear," Arthur said again. Something had happened to his voice. Martha took his hand. "How do I find him?" Arthur asked. "You don't," Martha said. "Not right now. Right now you finish your soup." Martha, Arthur, the soup. Arthur looked at his wife. This woman who had come outside in one shoe in the dying light of a Thursday evening and walked straight toward the most frightening person on the street without flinching, because their 49 years together were not something she was willing to lose without fighting for them. He picked up his spoon. And outside in the city, that was still talking, still processing, still sitting with the specific quality of a story that had broken through something outside the afternoon, was moving forward. And somewhere on the west side, Bear was at his table in the garage, and the Rose was on the steps of 4714 Maplewood. And 49 years of marriage had survived a Thursday night, and the world was slightly different than it had been 24 hours ago, in ways that were still becoming clear. The soup was finished. Arthur did not complain about it once, which Martha noted, and filed away as evidence that her husband had perhaps been more frightened than he was letting on. Because the Arthur Lawson she knew had opinions about food, strong ones, and a man who eats hospital soup without commentary is a man who has recently been reminded that eating anything at all is not guaranteed. Simone stayed. She pulled a second chair into the room and set up a quiet, competent base of operations phone charger coffee from the machine down the hall, a legal pad where she began making lists because Simone processed crisis through organization, and there was a great deal to organize. Carol needed updates every 2 hours. Arthur's regular doctor needed to be notified. Someone needed to water the container garden on the balcony. Insurance paperwork would arrive. Follow-up cardiology appointments would need scheduling. The elevator at 4714 Maplewood was still broken, and Arthur could not manage 3 flights of stairs for the foreseeable future, which meant the question of the apartment was a conversation that needed to happen, but not today. She made her lists and made her calls and let her grandparents exist in the particular quiet of 2 people who have come through something together and don't need to talk about it constantly to stay inside it. She watched them when she thought they weren't noticing, the way Arthur would reach for Martha's hand every 20 minutes or so without looking, and the way Martha's hand was always exactly where he could find it. Simone was not married. She had been close twice, and both times it had not worked, and she had made her peace with that in the practical, forward-moving way that she made peace with most things. But sitting in that hospital room, watching her grandparents' hands, she felt something she could not have named precisely, not envy, not quite longing, but something in the neighborhood of both, mixed with a kind of gratitude that these 2 people existed and that she was related to them. By 3 in the afternoon, the story had crossed a threshold. It was no longer just Detroit. A journalist from the Associated Press had filed a short piece, 300 words in, factual, careful naming, and no names beyond, an elderly Detroit couple and members of a local motorcycle club, because that was all the confirmed information available, and that piece had been picked up by 14 outlets in 4 hours. The framing varied depending on the outlet. Some led with the ambulance strike and used the bikers as illustration of the city's failures. Others led with the bikers and used the ambulance strike as context. 2 of them went straight for the human angle with headlines that leaned so hard into sentimentality that Bear, had he read them, would have found them mortifying. He did not read them. What Bear was doing at 3 in the afternoon was sitting across a table from a man named Roy Castellan, who was 64 years old and had been the chapter's informal legal contact for going on 15 years, and who had driven across town specifically to explain something to Bear in person. "They're going to find you," Roy said. He was a compact man, methodical with the delivery of someone who had spent decades being the person who told people things they did not want to hear. It's not a question of if the patch is visible in the footage, the chapter's been identified. It's already in two national pieces. Give it another 24 hours and someone's going to connect the dots to you specifically. Bear looked at him. And I want to know what you want to do about it. Nothing. Roy waited. He was experienced enough to know that Bear's first answer was not always his final answer, and that pushing immediately never worked. Bear got up and refilled his coffee. He stood at the counter with his back to Roy for a moment. Then he turned around. What are my options? You talk to them. One interview controlled you set the terms, gets ahead of it. Roy folded his hands on the table. Or you stay quiet and let the story tell itself without you, which means other people fill in the blanks with whatever they want. Other people fill in the blanks with us all the time, Bear said. That's not new. This is different. Roy's voice was even. This story is running in a direction that's Bear people are saying good things about the chapter. Real people, a lot of them. That's leverage you don't normally have. You want to leave that on the table? Bear looked at him for a long moment. What would I even say to a reporter? The truth, Roy said, which is that you saw someone who needed help and you helped them. That's it. That's the whole story. They'll make it into something else. Some of them will, Roy agreed. Some of them always do, but some of them won't. And right now, he stopped, adjusted. Right now, there are people in this city who have been afraid of this chapter for a very long time, and they're looking at what happened last night, and they're reconsidering. That's not nothing. Bear drank his coffee. He was thinking about Martha saying, I was terrified of you. He was thinking about her following it immediately with, then you've got more guts than half the people I know. He was thinking about what it meant that a 72-year-old woman in one shoe had been more willing to reach across the divide than anyone else on that block. Set up one, Bear said finally. Local, Detroit outlet. I talk for 20 minutes and they print what I actually say. If they change it, I never talk to anyone again. Roy nodded. He had already had a call from a Detroit Free Press reporter that morning and had been holding it in reserve for exactly this moment. I'll make the call. Roy, Bear stopped him. I want to know if the man made it, the husband. Can you find that out? Roy looked at him. I'll find out. He had the answer in 11 minutes because Simone had given her cell number to the nurse's station as a family contact. And Roy was the kind of man who could find a cell number when he needed to. He called, explained who he was and why he was calling, and Simone, who was in the hallway outside Arthur's room, when the call came and who had enough professional experience with unexpected phone calls to not hang up immediately on strangers, listened to his explanation, and then said very carefully, You're calling on behalf of the man who helped my grandparents. I am, Roy said. Simone was quiet for 3 seconds. He's stable. He's going to recover. The doctor said the speed of the transport made a significant difference. Roy wrote it down on his legal pad. Thank you, Ms. Simone, she said. Then after a brief pause, tell him my grandmother wants to say thank you properly. If that's something he'd be willing to, if there's a way to, she stopped, gathered herself. Tell him she'd like the chance to thank him in person, if he's willing. Roy looked across the table at Bear, who had heard enough of the call to follow its general direction, and was now looking at the wall with the expression of a man who is deciding something. I'll pass that along, Roy said. He hung up and looked at Bear. The old man made it, he said. Stable, recovering. Doctor confirmed the speed of transport saved him. He paused. The granddaughter says Martha Lawson would like to thank you in person. The garage was quiet. A car passed outside. Somewhere in the building, a tool hit a concrete floor and the sound rang out briefly and was gone. When does she go home? Bear asked. I don't know. Find out. By 4 o'clock, Arthur was sitting up straighter and had started asking questions about the container garden in a way that Martha recognized as his mind returning to its normal operating altitude. He wanted to know if the tomatoes had been watered. He wanted to know if the window had been left open because there was a trick with the airflow that mattered. He wanted to know how long they were going to keep him here and what the specific timeline looked like and whether he could negotiate on the dietary restrictions. Arthur, Simone said from her chair with her legal pad, you had a heart attack yesterday. I'm aware, Arthur said. I was there until Then maybe take the win and stop worrying about the tomatoes. Arthur looked at her. Then he looked at Martha. Martha's expression said with great affection that Simone was correct and he should listen to her. Fine, Arthur said. He lasted 4 minutes before he said to no one in particular, the tomatoes really do need water, though. Martha went to the window and called the building super, who she had never liked and who had never fixed the elevator, and who answered the phone with the weary defensiveness of a man who knew Martha Lawson's number and what it usually meant. She told him she needed someone to water the balcony plants, and the super said he'd see what he could do, and Martha said she would need more than see what he could do, and the super said he'd send someone up. It was a negotiation that lasted approximately 90 seconds and ended with Martha's terms accepted completely, which was how all of their negotiations ended. Arthur listened to this with the satisfied expression of a man watching his wife operate in her natural element. 49 years, he said to Simone, gesturing toward Martha, and she has never once not gotten what she needed. I heard that, Martha said from the window. I meant you too, Arthur said. This was almost normal. This was so close to normal that Simone had to press her lips together and look at her legal pad for a moment. The call came at 5:47. Martha's cell phone, an older model that she kept in a deep pocket of her house dress, and which Arthur frequently teased her about because she treated it like a burden to be endured rather than a tool to be used, lit up with a number she didn't recognize. She looked at the screen for a moment, then she answered. Mrs. Lawson, the voice on the other end was measured professional. My name is Roy Castellan. I'm calling on behalf of Bear. He asked me to relay that the chapter was glad to hear your husband is recovering. And a brief pause as if the next sentence required some navigation. He received your message through your granddaughter, and he would like to come by if that's something you want, to check in, just briefly. Martha stood up from her chair. Arthur and Simone both looked at her when Martha said, whenever is right for you. He's flexible. Martha looked at Arthur. Arthur, who had heard one side of this exchange and had no difficulty following it, nodded immediately, a single definitive nod. Tomorrow morning, Martha said, 10 o'clock. I'll let him know. She hung up. The room was quiet for a moment. He's coming, Arthur said. It wasn't a question. Tomorrow morning. Arthur settled back against his pillow with the slow, considered movement of a man whose chest reminded him to take things carefully. He was quiet for a moment. Then what would you bring a man like that as a thank you? You don't bring him anything, Simone said. You say thank you. No, Arthur said. No, you bring something. He thought about it. What is he like? Arthur, I don't know what he likes. Martha, you talk to him. Martha thought about Bear on her kitchen floor, 2 fingers at Arthur's throat counting. Bear on the stairs, arm around Arthur's shoulders, steady as something geological. Bear in the emergency bay looking at her with those flat, dark eyes that had turned out to contain something she had not expected. He likes coffee, she said. She didn't actually know this, but it felt true. Coffee, Arthur said. Good, that's something. He said it with the resolution of a man who has identified an actionable item, and then he closed his eyes because he was tired. And Martha sat back down and took his hand, and Simone returned to her legal pad, and the afternoon hospital sounds continued around them, the monitor beeping the distant PA, the particular institutional rhythm of a place where life was being carefully maintained. Simone looked at her grandmother. Are you nervous? She asked quietly. About tomorrow. Martha thought about it, about whether nervous was the right word for what she felt about the prospect of seeing Bear again, this time not in crisis, not in the desperate, stripped-down mathematics of an emergency, but in the daylight, in an ordinary room, as a person trying to thank another person for something that language was not quite built for. No, Martha said, and she meant it. What she felt was something closer to resolve, a sense that tomorrow morning was a thing that needed to happen properly, that the transaction between herself and Bear was not complete, that something had been opened between them that deserved to be closed with intention and with honesty and with the full weight of what it had actually been. She had reached for him. He had reached back. That deserved more than a note on a step. That night, Arthur slept well, for the first time real sleep, not the medicated half-consciousness of the previous night, but genuine settled sleep. Martha stayed again in the chair with a pillow Simone had materialized from somewhere and a better blanket than the previous night, and she slept too fitfully in the particular way of people who sleep in chairs, surfacing, occasionally checking the monitors, checking Arthur's breathing, returning to sleep. She dreamed at one point about Maplewood Avenue. In the dream, it was afternoon, not evening, and the street was bright and ordinary, and she was standing on the sidewalk, and she knew somehow that she was in the dream, that the thing she had done the previous evening had already happened, and it was behind her, and Arthur was safe. She felt in the dream an enormous specific peace, the peace of something having worked out when it very easily could not have. She woke at 3 in the morning and found Arthur looking at her. "You should go home and sleep," he said, properly. "I'm fine, Martha." His voice was quiet but certain. "Go home. Simone will stay." "Simone drove 4 hours. She needs to sleep too." "I'll be here in the morning," Simone said from the cot she had somehow also procured. Martha had not even known she was awake. "You are both ganging up on me," Martha said. "Yes," Simone agreed. Martha sat up, looked at Arthur, looked at Simone, looked at the monitors that said in their steady electronic way that everything was stable, that the heart that had tried to quit on Thursday evening was doing its job, that the rapid transport and the aspirin and Riggs's 2 careful fingers and Bear's arm on the stairs had all added up to something that the numbers could confirm. "All right," she said. She stood, put on her coat over the house dress, put on the foam socks she had not managed to get proper shoes, which was a fact she had simply made peace with. She leaned over and kissed Arthur's forehead. 10 o'clock, Arthur said. "About tomorrow, about Bear." 10 o'clock, she confirmed. She went home. Maplewood Avenue was quiet and dark and entirely ordinary at 3:15 in the morning, and Martha came through the front door of 4714 and climbed 3 flights of stairs, slowly, hand on the rail, and went into the apartment that smelled like Arthur, in their years together, and the faint tomato green scent of the balcony garden, and she sat down on the edge of the bed. The rose was gone from the step she had noticed when she came in. Someone had taken it. She hoped it was someone who needed it. She looked at the kitchen floor where Arthur had lain. Someone, Simone, probably practical as Simone, had straightened things up, moved the chairs back, restored the ordinary geography of the room. There was no sign of what had happened there. The floor was just a floor. But Martha sat on the edge of the bed, and she knew in the way you know things that have permanently altered the landscape that nothing in this apartment was quite the same as it had been 72 hours ago. Not the floor, not the stairs, not the space at the base of the front steps where a rose had briefly been. Everything was ordinary, and everything was changed, and she was very tired and very grateful in the deep structural way that only comes from having nearly lost something and finding yourself still holding it. She lay down on top of the covers without undressing and fell asleep in 3 minutes. She woke at 8:15 to sunlight, and Simone calling from the hospital to say Arthur had eaten breakfast and was demanding to know the plan for the day, and Martha said she'd be there by 9:30, and she got up and dressed properly for the first time since Thursday. Real clothes, real shoes. The careful, ordinary dignity of a woman who had survived something and was getting up on Saturday morning and going back out into the world. She made coffee, drank it standing at the kitchen counter, looking at the balcony where the tomato plant stood in its container green and improbable, and doing exactly what it was doing before any of this happened, which was just growing slowly, reaching for whatever light was available. At 9:43, she was back at the hospital, sitting in Arthur's room, while he and Simone conducted a spirited negotiation about whether he was allowed to sit in a regular chair or had to stay in the bed, a negotiation that Arthur was losing on points, because Simone had the doctor's instructions memorized, and Arthur did not have a strong counter-argument beyond personal preference, which was not medically speaking relevant. At 9:58, Martha's phone showed a text from Roy Castellan's number. "He's in the parking lot. Give the word." Martha showed it to Arthur. "Tell him to come up," Arthur said immediately. Martha texted back, "Room 4, 3rd floor." They waited. Arthur straightened his blanket. He was aware this was faintly absurd, a man in a hospital bed straightening his blanket because a Hell's Angel was coming up in the elevator. But he did it anyway because Arthur Lawson believed that how you presented yourself to people mattered regardless of circumstance. Simone stood up from her chair and moved to the window, creating space, and then was very studiously looking at something on her phone while actually watching the doorway. Martha sat in the chair beside Arthur's bed with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight. They heard him before they saw him. Not the engine, no engine, just footsteps in the corridor, the particular weight and rhythm of a large man walking at a measured pace. The footsteps stopped outside the room. There was a pause, a brief one, barely 2 seconds, and then Bear appeared in the doorway. He was in his leather vest over a black shirt because that was what he wore, and the patches were visible and the size of him in a hospital room doorway was notable. He had his helmet in one hand. He looked at Arthur in the bed. He looked at Martha in the chair. He looked at Simone by the window, who had stopped pretending to look at her phone. "Mr. Lawson," Bear said. His voice was the same low gravel and bass, but something in the register of it was different than it had been on Maplewood Avenue. Quieter, maybe. More careful. "You look better than the last time I saw you." Arthur's face broke into the first full, proper smile it had managed in 2 days. "That's a low bar," he said. Bear's mouth moved in the direction of something. "Oin." "Yeah," he said, "it is." "Come in," Arthur said. "Please." Bear came in. He stood at the foot of the bed, and he was aware Bear was always aware in every room of where the door was and where the window was and where everyone in the space was standing. It was not paranoia. It was 40 years of being a man that other men sometimes had opinions about. You knew the room. You always knew the room. But this room was a hospital room with monitors beeping and a man who had his hands folded on a hospital blanket looking at him with the direct, honest attention of someone who had something important to say. And the thing Bear always knew was that this kind of attention was not a threat. It was a different thing entirely. "I need to thank you," Arthur said, directly. No preamble. Arthur Lawson had not made it to 68 years old by circling around things. "You don't need to." "I do." Arthur's voice was firm. "You carried me down 3 flights of stairs. You held my hand. You told me I was going to make it." "Bear," he stopped. Something had happened to his voice again. He took a breath, the measured breath of a man managing emotion with practice. "I believed you. I want you to know that. Whatever was happening to me, I believed you. And I'm here because of it." The room was very quiet. Bear looked at Arthur Lawson, this lean, white-haired man with his strong hands, and his straightforward grief and his completely unguarded gratitude, and he felt something happen in his chest that he had not felt in a long time. It was not comfortable. It was the particular discomfort of being seen accurately, of being given credit for exactly the thing you actually did with no distortion in either direction. "You held on," Bear said. "That was you. Because you told me to." "I told you to. You did it." Bear shook his head slightly. "That's not the same thing." Martha was watching this exchange with the careful attention of someone who understands they are watching something real. Simone had her hands pressed together in front of her mouth and was very still. Arthur reached out his hand. Not weak this time. Not the faint flutter of a man on the edge of consciousness. His actual hand extended steady. Bear looked at it. Then he reached out and shook it, and his hand around Arthur's was enormous and scarred and certain, and Arthur gripped it the way he gripped things firmly, fully, with all the intention he had. "Thank you," Arthur said, "for being the kind of man who gets off his bike." Bear looked at him for a moment. Something had changed in his face, not softened exactly because Bear's face did not really soften, but something had shifted. Something that had been held at a particular tension had released slightly. "Your wife," Bear said, "is the bravest person on Maplewood Avenue." Arthur looked at Martha. Martha looked at Arthur. "I know," Arthur said. "I've known that for 49 years. Bear looked at Martha then, and Martha looked back at him. This man who had answered when she called across every barrier the world had put between them, and she said simply and completely, "Thank you for not riding away." Bear held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, the same nod he had given her in the emergency bay, the nod that meant, "I hear you. It's real. We don't need more words than this." Simone from the window said very quietly, "Would you like some coffee? I have terrible hospital coffee, but I have it." Bear looked at her. "Yeah," he said, "I would." And so they sat the Hell's Angel in the hospital chair with his helmet on the floor beside him, Simone on the second chair with her legal pad face down, Arthur in his bed with his hands on his blanket, Martha beside him with her hand where he could reach it, and they drank terrible coffee and they talked. Not about the strike or the internet or the reporters or the 40,000 people who had watched Deshaun's video. They talked about Arthur's 31 years at Ford. They talked about Bear's time in the Army, which he described in the minimally specific way of someone who has decided what they will and will not share about a particular period of their life. They talked about the container garden, and Bear unprompted said he had a brother who grew tomatoes in the back of his property outside the city, and had opinions about soil composition that went on for an uncomfortable length of time. Arthur laughed, properly laughed for the first time since the kitchen floor, and then made a face because laughing pulled something into his chest, and Martha immediately said his name in the particular two-syllable way that meant, "Don't you dare push it," and Bear watched this and said nothing, but his expression did the thing that was adjacent to a smile. 20 minutes. That was how long he had said he would stay. He stayed for 45. When he finally stood and picked up his helmet, the room had the quality of a space in which something has been properly completed, not finished in the sense of being over, but finished in the sense of being whole. "If you're ever on Maplewood," Bear said from the doorway to Arthur. "You'll know if I am," Arthur said. "I'm the one with the container garden on the third-floor balcony." Bear looked at him. "Right," he said. He nodded to Martha, to Simone, and then he was gone, his footsteps in the corridor steady and certain, receding toward the elevator. The three of them sat in the room for a moment. "Well," Simone said finally. "Yes," Martha agreed. Arthur was looking at the doorway. His expression was the expression of a man who has taken the full measure of something and found it larger than he expected, and is sitting with that largeness, not trying to reduce it, just letting it be the size it actually is. "Good man," Arthur said quietly. The monitors beeped. The hospital moved around them. Outside, Detroit was doing what Detroit did on a Saturday morning, noisy and complicated, and entirely itself, and somewhere in the parking lot below, an engine started and built into something large and certain, and rolled out into the city and was gone. The elevator at 4714 Maplewood Avenue got fixed on a Tuesday, not by the super who had been promising to fix it for 6 months and had shown no meaningful progress toward that goal. It got fixed because on Monday evening, 3 Hells Angels showed up at the building with a man named Vic, who had spent 20 years as a commercial elevator technician before he retired, and who owed Bear a favor from a situation that neither of them discussed in detail. Vic looked at the elevator for 40 minutes, went and got 2 parts, came back and had the thing running by 9 o'clock that night. The super did not ask questions. Vic did not offer explanations. The elevator worked, and the next morning when Martha came back from the hospital with Arthur, 12 days after the kitchen floor, 12 days of monitors and medication adjustments and dietary negotiations, and Arthur arguing with every nurse who would engage him, and Simone running logistics from her chair with her legal pad. Arthur stepped into a working elevator on the ground floor of his building and rode it to the 3rd floor without having to manage a single stair. He didn't say anything when the doors opened on the 3rd floor. He just stood there for a second in the elevator doorway, and Martha stood beside him, and they both understood, without speaking, that the elevator being fixed was not an accident and was not the super's doing, and was the kind of thing that did not require discussion. "Tomatoes," Arthur said, finally stepping out into the hallway. "Arthur, I just want to see them." She let him see them. They were fine. Better than fine, actually. Whoever had been watering them had been doing it correctly, which Martha had not entirely expected from the super's building staff. The tomatoes were coming in slow but steady, green-shouldered, and promising, reaching toward the afternoon light the way they always did. Arthur stood on the balcony and looked at them for a long time. Martha watched him from the doorway. She watched the set of his shoulders and the way he breathed carefully with the new practiced deliberateness of a man who had been told to pay attention to his breathing and had for once in his life decided to listen. And she felt the strange doubled quality of this moment, ordinary and extraordinary. At the same time, the simple fact of her husband standing on their balcony looking at tomato plants, the most precious thing she had seen in 2 weeks. "I want to send something to the chapter," Arthur said without turning around. "I've been thinking about it." "Arthur, we've talked about this." "Not flowers." He turned. "Not flowers, Martha. I want to do something real." He had clearly been composing this for days because it came out with the organized precision of a man who has thought through his argument. Those men dropped everything on a Thursday night for 2 people they had never met. Riggs knew what he was doing in that van. The elevator, he gestured toward the hallway. The elevator is working, something real, something that says we understand what was given to us. Martha looked at him. She'd been thinking about it too, actually. She had been thinking about it since the hospital, since the 45 minutes of terrible coffee and real conversation, since Bear had nodded at her from the doorway of room 4 on the 3rd floor of Detroit General, with that particular nod that contained everything it needed to contain. "Simone had an idea," Martha said. Arthur waited. "She knows someone at the Detroit Community Foundation. A small fund, nothing large, we don't have large, but a named fund for emergency medical transport assistance, for situations like ours when the system fails and people can't get help. She paused. In both our names and Bear's. Arthur was very still. She said Bear would have to agree to it, Martha continued. She said we'd need his permission to use his name, or whatever name he wants to use, and she said he might say no, and if he says no, we do it without his name. But she thought, Martha stopped. I thought he should be asked. Arthur looked at her for a long time. That's the right thing, he said quietly. That's exactly the right thing. Roy Castellan can reach him. Then call Roy Castellan. She called Roy Castellan. The conversation was short and practical because Roy Castellan operated in short and practical, and he said he would relay the proposal and get back to her. He called back in 2 hours. Bear had said yes on one condition. Roy read it from his notes. His name doesn't go on it. He said, and I'm quoting directly, put the rose on it, not my name. The rose. Martha heard this and sat down on the kitchen chair and pressed her free hand flat against the table and breathed. The rose, she repeated. That's what he said. She thought about the photo Simone had shown her on the phone, the single red rose tucked into the corner of the concrete step, the rough note in large, careful handwriting. Kindness has no uniform. She thought about the woman at the bodega who had gone into the back and come out with her own private rose and waved away Bear's money. Tell him yes, Martha said. Tell him the rose is perfect. The fund was established quietly without announcement in the 3rd week of October. Simone handled the paperwork with the same focused efficiency she brought to everything. The initial contribution was small. The Lawsons were not wealthy. People had never been wealthy people, and 49 years of a Ford assembly plant salary and a part-time bookkeeping practice had given them a solid, careful, modest life, not a large one. But Roy Castellan made a call, and Dagger made a call, and the woman from the bodega whose name was Elena, and who had been following the story from the beginning with the intense investment of someone who felt personally adjacent to it, organized a neighborhood collection that raised $412 in a weekend. The fund, when it launched, had enough in it to assist 11 families in its first year of operation. The rose was its symbol, a single red rose on a plain white background because Bear had said not his name and he had not said anything about the rose, and Martha had decided the rose said everything that needed saying anyway. Deshaun, the teenager who had posted the original video, found out about the fund from a community page share and showed up at Elena's bodega to ask about it because he was 17, and the story had gotten inside him in a way that 17-year-old stories sometimes do, the kind that point you in a direction before you fully understand where you're going. Elena told him about it over the counter while she restocked the refrigerated section, and Deshaun listened and said, I want to help. What do I do? And Elena looked at him and said, you come back Saturday. We're doing an outreach table. And he did. He came back the Saturday after that too. Gerald, the old man from the stoop, was interviewed 3 more times, twice by journalists, once by a podcaster from Chicago, who was doing a series on urban community stories. He told it the same way each time because it had happened the way it happened, and there was no version of it that needed embellishment. He always ended the same way. The moment he got off the bike, that's the thing. You think you know who people are, and then someone gets off the bike and you understand that you don't know anything really. You're just guessing. The podcaster's episode got 40,000 downloads in its first week. Several people in the comments said it made them call someone they hadn't spoken to in a long time. 3 people said it made them reconsider something they had been avoiding. One person who left the comment anonymously said it made them get off their metaphorical bike, and it was the best decision they had made in years. Nobody knew exactly what that meant, but it sat in the comment thread and people kept liking it. Bear did not listen to the podcast. Bear remained substantially uninterested in the media dimension of any of this, which Roy respected and protected, with the practiced ease of a man who had been managing Bear's interface with the world for 15 years. When the Detroit Free Press piece ran 20 minutes of conversation condensed to 800 words with Bear quoted 4 times, the 4 quotes were precise and unadorned and said exactly what he had said and nothing more. The piece ran under the headline, When the System Failed, Someone Else Showed Up. Bear's 4 quotes in full. She grabbed my sleeve. You don't ride away from that. We weren't trying to be heroes. A man needed to get to a hospital. That's it. The chapter has always known how to move. We just pointed it in a different direction for one night. And the last one, which the reporter had almost cut and then decided she could not cut because it was the truest thing in the piece. She said she was terrified of me. She grabbed my sleeve anyway. That's not something you forget. Arthur read the piece in his chair by the window. The doctor had approved light reading in a comfortable chair, which Arthur had interpreted as broadly as possible. And when he finished, he folded the paper and set it on the side table and said nothing for a moment. He's a good man, Arthur said. For the third time since the hospital, he kept coming back to it the way you come back to something that remains true each time you check it. Yes, Martha said. She was in the kitchen making lunch. Real lunch, not hospital food, not Simone's takeout, but her own food in her own kitchen, with the afternoon light coming through the window and Arthur's voice from the next room. The ordinary geography of their life reconstituted. I want to go to Maplewood, Arthur said. Martha put down the spoon. Arthur, just to stand there on the block. I want to stand where it happened. He paused. I can do stairs. The doctor said light activity. The doctor said light activity, meaning a slow walk around the block, not a pilgrimage to the site of your cardiac event. It's the same block. Arthur. Martha. His voice came through with the particular quality it sometimes had, not loud, not demanding, but settled, certain, the voice of a man who had made up his mind and was offering her the information as a courtesy rather than an opening for negotiation. I need to see it. I don't entirely remember it. I remember the floor. I remember your voice. I remember his voice, but I don't remember the outside. I need to see the outside. She understood this. She actually understood it completely, which was why she stopped arguing. They went on a Wednesday afternoon, 2 weeks after Arthur came home. Simone had gone back to Columbus. By then, Arthur had told her, on her 5th day of staying, that she had her own life and she needed to go live it, and that he was not a project. He was her grandfather, and she should call instead of hovering, which was the most Arthur thing he had said since the kitchen floor. And Simone had driven back to Columbus with the particular mix of exasperation and relief that family members feel when the person they were frightened for returns fully to themselves. They walked slowly, Martha and Arthur, down 3 flights of the working elevator and out through the front door of 4714 Maplewood. It was a clear October afternoon, the kind of afternoon Detroit occasionally produces like a gift, where the light is particular and golden, and the air has that specific edge that means summer is genuinely finished and the world is moving on. Arthur stood on the sidewalk and looked at the street. Martha stood beside him and let him look. He was looking at the spot where the Harley had been parked, the spot where Martha had stood when she made her decision and walked forward. The unremarkable stretch of cracked city sidewalk that had been for a few minutes on a Thursday evening in September, the location of something that had rippled outward far further than a stretch of cracked sidewalk had any right to. Here, Arthur said quietly. Yes. He looked at the street for another long moment. Then he put his arm around Martha's shoulders carefully, with the new careful deliberateness of a man whose body had terms and conditions now, and she put her arm around his waist, and they stood there together on the sidewalk in front of their building on a Wednesday afternoon in October. You walked towards him, Arthur said. From right here. Yes. Were you thinking about me? Martha considered this. The honest answer, the complete answer, the one she had been turning over since the moment it happened. I was only thinking about you, she said. There wasn't room for anything else. Arthur tightened his arm around her, said nothing, which was after 49 years its own complete language. They were standing like that when a motorcycle turned onto Maplewood Avenue. Not a full convoy, not 6 bikes in formation, just one. A big Harley chrome catching the afternoon light engine, a low measured rumble that Martha recognized before she had consciously processed that she was recognizing it. Arthur heard it too. She felt him go slightly still. The Harley slowed as it came down the block. Bear saw them from a distance. He had seen everything from a distance for long enough that it was simply how his eyes worked, and he brought the bike to the curb in front of 4714, the same curb, the same Thursday evening ritual spot, and he shut off the engine. He looked at Arthur standing on the sidewalk with his arm around his wife. Arthur looked at Bear on his motorcycle. The street was quiet, no crowd this time, no pedestrians stopping, no old man on the stoop, though Gerald's building was right there, and it was possible, likely, even that Gerald was watching from somewhere, because Gerald watched the block the way people watch things they consider their responsibility. Bear got off the bike. He walked toward them, not fast, not slow, and he stopped about 3 feet away, and he looked at Arthur with the same direct, assessing attention he had given Martha on this sidewalk 7 weeks ago, and his face did the same thing her face had probably done, cataloged the change. The man was thinner. The man moved with a new care. The man's eyes, though the man's eyes were completely recognizably Arthur. "You look better than the hospital," Bear said. "That is an extremely low bar," Arthur said for the second time, with the cheerful precision of a man who enjoyed a recurring line. Bear's mouth moved all the way this time. An actual smile, brief asymmetrical there, and gone but real. "How are the tomatoes?" Arthur's face broke open completely. "You remembered. You mentioned them twice in 45 minutes. "They're coming in," Arthur said. "Slow, but coming. You should see them in spring." Bear looked at him. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe." Martha was watching Bear's face when he said it, and she caught the thing that passed through his expression in the half-second after. Not a polite, maybe not a brush-off, maybe, but an actual maybe, the maybe of a man who is permitting himself for the first time in some time to think about a specific ordinary thing in the future. A balcony, tomatoes, spring. She filed it away. "The fund," Martha said. "The rose, you saw it." "Roy told me." Bear looked at her. "You didn't have to do that." "We know," Martha said. "That's why we did it." Bear held her gaze. And in that moment, on the sidewalk in front of 4714 Maplewood Avenue, under the October light, with the engine ticking as it cooled behind him, something passed between these two people that had no adequate name in any language Martha knew. It was recognition. It was gratitude that had moved beyond gratitude into something more permanent. It was the specific bond that forms between people who have seen each other at the absolute stripped-back edge of things and found in that seeing that they were not what the other expected. She had expected a man who would ride away. He had expected what an old woman who needed redirecting to a phone, a situation he could gesture toward and keep moving. Not this, not 49 years of marriage standing on a sidewalk, reaching for him with both hands and meaning it completely. Neither of them had gotten what they expected. Both of them had gotten something better. "Bear," Martha said, "thank you for being here." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said in the low gravel and bass voice that Maplewood Avenue had always understood as a warning, and that Martha Lawson had decided to hear differently from the very first second she chose to walk toward it rather than away from it. "Thank you for asking." He got back on the bike. The engine started that enormous, certain sound that filled the block and said, "I am here, I am moving, the world is in motion." And Bear looked at Martha one more time and nodded and pulled out into the street. Martha and Arthur stood on the sidewalk and watched him go. The engine sound receded down Maplewood, turned the corner, became part of the larger sound of the city, and then was gone. Arthur's arm was still around Martha's shoulders. Martha's arm was still around his waist. They stood on the cracked sidewalk in front of their building in the October afternoon, and above them the balcony held a container garden that was slowly, stubbornly producing tomatoes. And inside the building, the elevator worked, and 11 families in Detroit had a resource they hadn't had before, and somewhere on the west side, a man named Bear was riding through the city he had always claimed as his own, carrying something he had not carried before this September, the knowledge specific and unambiguous, that one person reaching toward another across every barrier the world constructs is still the most powerful thing that happens on Earth. Martha had reached. He had reached back. Arthur was standing beside her. That was the whole story. That was every word of it. And not one syllable of it would ever be any less true than it was on the sidewalk on that October afternoon, in that city, in that life on the block, where a woman in one shoe had walked toward the thing she was most afraid of because love had given her no other option. She had grabbed his sleeve, and the world slowly and perfectly, one extraordinary Thursday evening at a time, had grabbed back.